When the name Galileo Galilei echoes through history, it conjures vivid images of a lone visionary standing firm against a tide of doubt, the eternal clash between science and faith, the revolutionary idea that Earth orbits the Sun, or the harrowing tales of his trial, torture, imprisonment, and defiance. But how much of this legend is truth, and how much is myth woven by time? He turned his instrument upward and saw mountains on the moon, watched moons orbit Jupiter, observed the phases of Venus like a smaller twin of our own moon. He sketched what he saw with careful hands, published his findings, and changed everything humanity thought it knew about its place in the cosmos. Yet for all his vision, for all his ability to peer into the heavens and understand what he witnessed there, this same man would spend his final years under house arrest, blind, forbidden by the most powerful institution of his age from teaching what he knew to be true. Let's unravel the Galileo affair and his infamous trial, a story often framed as science versus religion. We'll explore 4 key threads. Who was Galileo truly? His early years, how he found his path from Pisa to Padua, his first controversy, what sparked his trial and the forces behind it, and his final years. Galileo Galilei entered the world on February 15, 1564, in Pisa, a city already ancient even then, its famous leaning tower standing as testament to both human ambition and the humbling reality of unstable ground. His father, Vincenzo Galilei, was a musician and music theorist, a man who understood that the beauty of sound could be studied, measured, analyzed. Vincenzo was not content simply to play the lute beautifully. He wanted to understand why certain combinations of notes pleased the ear, while others created discord. He conducted experiments, testing how the tension of a string affected its pitch, questioning the established musical theories of his day. In this household of careful listening and methodical investigation, young Galileo learned his first lessons about how the world worked. Imagine the boy in those early years, growing up in a home where questions were encouraged, where his father would demonstrate principles of harmony by plucking strings of different lengths and thicknesses. The family was not wealthy. Vincenzo earned his living as a musician and cloth trader, and there were many children to support. Galileo was the eldest of 6 siblings, though 2 would die young, as was tragically common in that era. The responsibilities of the firstborn son weighed on him early. He would need to make his own way in the world, to find a profession that could support not only himself, but potentially his younger siblings and aging parents. When Galileo was about 10 years old, the family moved to Florence, the jewel of Tuscany, a city alive with art and learning. Florence in the 1570s was a place where the Renaissance still echoed in every piazza and palazzo, where the works of Leonardo and Michelangelo were relatively recent memories, where the Medici family ruled with a combination of political cunning and genuine patronage of the arts and sciences. Here, young Galileo attended school at the monastery of Santa Maria di Vallombrosa. The monks taught him grammar, logic, and rhetoric, the foundations of a classical education. Some accounts suggest he even considered becoming a priest himself during these years, drawn perhaps to the contemplative life, to the quiet pursuit of knowledge within monastery walls. But Vincenzo had other plans for his eldest son. A career in the church might offer security, but it would not offer wealth, and the family needed someone who could earn a substantial living. Medicine, that was the path. Physicians were respected, well paid, essential members of society. In 1581, when Galileo was 17, his father enrolled him at the University of Pisa to study medicine. Picture the young man returning to his birthplace, now as a university student, walking through streets he had known as a small child, carrying books on anatomy and the theories of Galen, the ancient Greek physician whose teachings still dominated medical education. Galileo proved to be a capable student, but medicine did not capture his heart. His mind wandered during lectures on the 4 humors and the properties of various herbs and remedies. What fascinated him instead were patterns, proportions, the way things moved through space. There is a famous story, probably embellished over the years, but containing a kernel of truth, about Galileo attending Mass at the cathedral in Pisa. A lamp hanging from the ceiling, set swinging by someone lighting it, caught his attention. As it swayed back and forth, he noticed something curious. Using his own pulse as a timer, he observed that the lamp took the same amount of time to complete each swing, whether the arc was wide or narrow. The period of the pendulum, he realized, was independent of the amplitude. This observation would later prove fundamental to understanding oscillating motion and eventually to the development of accurate timekeeping devices. But in those early university days, such insights were private discoveries, not yet part of any formal study. Galileo dutifully attended his medical lectures, while his true interests pulled him elsewhere. He began to attend lectures on mathematics and geometry, subjects not part of his official curriculum. He discovered Euclid's Elements, that ancient masterwork of logical reasoning and spatial relationships, and something clicked in his mind. Here was a way of thinking that felt natural to him, a method of building knowledge step by careful step from first principles. Mathematics offered certainty in a way that medicine, with all its competing theories and uncertain outcomes, did not. Around this time, Galileo met Ostilio Ricci, a mathematician who served at the Tuscan court and occasionally lectured at the university. Ricci recognized something in the young medical student, a genuine aptitude for mathematical thinking. He took Galileo under his wing, teaching him privately, introducing him to the works of Archimedes, the ancient Greek mathematician and engineer whose insights into geometry, leverage, and the behavior of floating bodies had never been surpassed. Archimedes became Galileo's intellectual hero. He was someone who did not merely theorize about the physical world, but investigated it directly, devising clever experiments and careful observations to test ideas. Vincenzo was not pleased when he learned his son was neglecting medicine in favor of mathematics. What future was there in mathematics? It would not pay the bills or support a family. The two argued, with Galileo passionately defending his newfound love for geometry and mathematical reasoning, and Vincenzo insisting on the practical necessity of completing medical training. But Galileo's commitment had shifted irrevocably. He could not force himself to care about medical theory when his mind was alive with questions about motion, force, and mathematical proof. In 1585, without completing his degree, Galileo left the University of Pisa. He returned to Florence without a degree, without a profession, without clear prospects. For a young man in his early 20s in the 16th century, this was a precarious position. He began tutoring students in mathematics to earn some money. He worked on his own investigations, trying to make a name for himself in the small world of Italian mathematics. He wrote a treatise on the hydrostatic balance, a device for measuring the specific gravity of objects based on principles laid out by Archimedes. He submitted it to prominent mathematicians, hoping to gain recognition. These were lean years, uncertain years, but also years when Galileo was forming the habits of thought and methods of investigation that would define his later work. In his small room in Florence by candlelight, Galileo wrestled with problems of motion and equilibrium. How do bodies fall through space? Why do some objects float while others sink? Can mathematical reasoning reveal the hidden architecture of physical reality? These questions, ancient yet somehow fresh, when approached with fresh eyes and a willingness to test assumptions, occupied his mind during those early formative years. He could not have known then where these questions would lead him, how the simple act of dropping objects from different heights or rolling balls down inclined planes would eventually undermine centuries of accepted wisdom. He knew only that these investigations felt necessary, as natural to him as breathing, and that somehow he had to find a way to make a life around this burning curiosity about how the world worked. By 1589, Galileo's persistence began to yield results. His work had come to the attention of scholars and patrons, and he received an appointment as lecturer of mathematics at the University of Pisa, the same institution where he had been a student just a few years earlier. It was not a prestigious position. Mathematics was considered less important than philosophy or medicine in the academic hierarchy of the time. The salary was modest, far less than professors in other disciplines earned. But for Galileo, now 205 years old, it was a beginning, a foot in the door of academic life, and most importantly, it gave him the freedom to pursue his investigations. Picture him now as a young professor, returning to Pisa, not as a wayward medical student, but as a lecturer, standing before classes of young men, teaching them the principles of Euclidean geometry and the basics of mathematical astronomy. He was known as an effective teacher, able to make complex ideas clear, but also as someone who asked uncomfortable questions about established doctrines. The prevailing wisdom about motion and mechanics came from Aristotle, the ancient Greek philosopher whose authority in the universities was almost unchallengeable. Aristotle had taught that heavier objects fall faster than lighter ones, that the natural state of objects was rest, and that any motion required a continuous force to sustain it. But Galileo was not content to simply repeat what Aristotle had said. He wanted to test these ideas to see if they actually described how objects behave. There is a famous legend that he dropped objects of different weights from the Leaning Tower of Pisa to demonstrate that they fell at the same rate, contradicting Aristotle. Whether this dramatic public demonstration actually occurred is uncertain. Many historians doubt the story, suggesting it was exaggerated or invented later. But what is certain is that Galileo did conduct careful experiments with falling bodies, using inclined planes to slow the motion down enough that he could observe and measure it accurately. He found that, contrary to Aristotle, objects of different weights fell at essentially the same rate when air resistance was negligible. The determining factor was not the weight, but the acceleration due to gravity, which was constant. These findings put him at odds with the Aristotelian professors around him. Academic disputes in that era could be bitter affairs, conducted in Latin treatises and public debates. Galileo's willingness to challenge Aristotle, to suggest that ancient authority could be corrected through observation and experiment, made him enemies among the more traditional faculty. Additionally, his sharp tongue and sometimes sarcastic manner of debate did not help his cause. He could be cutting in his criticism of ideas he found illogical, and not everyone appreciated being shown to be wrong, especially by someone so young and in such a junior position. Meanwhile, Galileo's financial situation remained difficult. His salary at Pisa was barely enough to live on, and he had family obligations. His father, Vincenzo, died in 1591, leaving debts and leaving Galileo as the head of the family, responsible for his mother, his siblings, and the dowries his sisters would need to marry. In Renaissance Italy, a proper dowry was essential for a daughter to make a good marriage, and the amounts expected could be substantial. Galileo found himself stretched thin, trying to make ends meet on an academic salary that was never designed to support an extended family. In 1592, an opportunity arose that would change his circumstances considerably. The University of Padua, located in the Republic of Venice, one of the most enlightened and intellectually free states in Europe at that time, was looking for a professor of mathematics. Padua was a prestigious institution, and the salary offered was significantly better than what Galileo was making in Pisa. He applied, competed against other candidates, and won the position. In late 1592, at age 28, Galileo moved to Padua, beginning what he would later describe as the happiest 18 years of his life. Padua was a revelation. The Venetian Republic maintained a careful independence from the Papal States, and its university enjoyed considerably more intellectual freedom than institutions in other parts of Italy. Here, professors could explore ideas without quite the same level of ecclesiastical oversight. The city itself was beautiful, with its arcaded streets and river running through. close enough to Venice that Galileo could visit that remarkable city of canals and commerce whenever he wished. The salary, while still not making him wealthy, was enough to live comfortably and begin addressing his family debts. As a professor at Padua, Galileo taught geometry, astronomy, and mechanics. His lectures were popular, drawing students from across Europe. He had a gift for explaining complex ideas in clear terms, and students appreciated his willingness to engage with practical applications of mathematics, not just abstract theory. Beyond his teaching duties, Galileo was free to conduct his own research, and he threw himself into investigations of motion, mechanics, and the behavior of materials. During these Padua years, Galileo made his living not only from his university salary, but also from private tutoring and the sale of mathematical instruments. He designed and manufactured a geometric and military compass, a calculating instrument that could be used for a variety of practical purposes, including artillery calculations, engineering, and finance. He ran what amounted to a small workshop out of his home, with assistants helping to produce these instruments, which he sold to nobles, military officers, and merchants. This entrepreneurial side of Galileo is often overlooked, but it was essential to his survival and provided him with valuable practical experience in precision instrument making, knowledge that would prove crucial later when he turned to improving the telescope. In Padua, Galileo also began a long-term relationship with Marina Gamba, a woman from Venice. They never married, which was not particularly scandalous for a university professor of that era, particularly in the relatively liberal Venetian Republic. Together they had 3 children, 2 daughters, Virginia and Livia, born in 1600 and 1601, and a son, Vincenzo, born in 1606. Galileo cared for his children and ensured they were provided for. Though his daughters would eventually enter a convent, the typical path for daughters of unmarried parents who lacked sufficient dowries for good marriages. These years in Padua, from 1592 to 1610, were a time of deep investigation and steady work. Galileo studied the motion of projectiles, developing mathematical descriptions of parabolic trajectories. He investigated the strength of materials, considering why beams break under certain loads and how hollow bones can be stronger than solid ones of the same weight. He worked on problems of mechanics and engineering, corresponding with other mathematicians and natural philosophers across Europe. He was building a reputation as one of the foremost mathematical minds of his generation, known for his ability to apply mathematical reasoning to physical problems in ways that yielded genuine insights. But the most significant work of these years was happening quietly, in his systematic thinking about motion. Galileo was developing a new physics, one based not on philosophical arguments about the nature of things, but on careful observation and mathematical description of how things actually behave. He realized that the key to understanding motion was to strip away complications like friction and air resistance, to think about ideal cases, and then to see how actual motion approximated these ideals. This was a revolutionary way of thinking. It meant accepting that perfect mathematical descriptions might not exactly match messy reality, but that they could reveal the underlying principles governing that reality. Consider him during these years in his home in Padua, surrounded by books and instruments, teaching during the day, and conducting experiments in whatever time remained, writing up his findings in careful Latin or Italian, always pushing to understand just a bit more about how the world worked. He was respected, productive, intellectually engaged, and living in a place that gave him the freedom to pursue his ideas. These were good years, stable years. Years when Galileo was building the foundation of knowledge and methods that would soon be applied to questions far more dramatic and consequential than rolling balls down ramps. The stage was being set, though he did not yet know it, for discoveries that would shake the foundations of astronomy and cosmology, and for conflicts that would define the rest of his life. The year 1609 marked a turning point, though it began with a rumor. Word reached Padua of an invention in the Netherlands, a device using lenses that could make distant objects appear closer. Spectacle makers in Holland had apparently discovered that holding two lenses at a certain distance from each other produced a magnifying effect. News of this invention spread quickly across Europe, carried by merchants and travelers. For most people, it was a curiosity, perhaps useful for military purposes, or for seeing distant ships at sea. But when Galileo heard about it, he recognized the potential immediately. Without ever having seen one of these Dutch telescopes, working only from descriptions of the basic principle, Galileo set about making his own. He understood optics and how lenses refracted light, bending rays to create images. He experimented with different combinations of lenses with different focal lengths and placements, working in his workshop with the careful precision of someone used to making mathematical instruments. His first attempts produced only modest magnification, perhaps 3 or 4 times. But Galileo was not satisfied with modest results. He kept refining the design, grinding lenses to better shapes, adjusting the distances between them. Within a few months, he had created a telescope that could magnify objects 9 times, then 20 times, and eventually up to 30 times their apparent size. On a summer evening in 1609, Galileo took his telescope to the top of the Campanile in Venice, the tall bell tower overlooking the city and its lagoon. He invited members of the Venetian Senate to look through his instrument. They were astounded. Ships that were invisible to the naked eye, still hours from port, could be seen clearly. The military and commercial applications were immediately obvious. Venice was a maritime power. Being able to spot approaching vessels long before they reached the harbor could provide crucial strategic advantages. The Senate was impressed. They increased Galileo's salary and granted him tenure at Padua. For Galileo, this was a significant financial improvement, and it validated the practical value of his work with lenses and optics. But Galileo was already thinking beyond military and commercial uses. As autumn came and the nights grew longer, he began turning his telescope upward, toward the moon, the planets, and the stars. What he saw astonished him and would astonish the world. The moon, when viewed through the telescope, was not the smooth, perfect sphere that Aristotelian philosophy claimed all celestial bodies must be. Its surface was rough, pocked with craters, marked by mountain ranges that cast shadows across the lunar landscape. Galileo observed these shadows carefully, measuring how they changed as the moon passed through its phases, even calculating the approximate heights of the lunar mountains by analyzing the shadow lengths. This observation alone was profound. For centuries, the prevailing cosmology held that the heavens were perfect and unchanging, fundamentally different from the corrupt and mutable Earth. If the moon had mountains and valleys like Earth, then perhaps the celestial and terrestrial realms were not so different after all. Perhaps the heavens were not made of some perfect crystalline substance, but of ordinary matter, subject to the same principles as the world beneath our feet. Then, in early January of 1610, Galileo made an even more remarkable discovery. Turning his telescope toward Jupiter, the bright planet that wandered across the night sky, he noticed 3 small points of light near it, lined up like a string of pearls. He assumed at first they were background stars, but when he looked again the next night, they had moved, and they were now on the other side of Jupiter. Over the following nights, he observed them systematically. Sometimes there were 3, sometimes 4 of these little points of light. They appeared on different sides of Jupiter, sometimes forming a line, sometimes scattered. After careful observation and calculation, Galileo realized what he was seeing: moons orbiting Jupiter. Here were celestial bodies that clearly did not orbit the Earth. They circled Jupiter, forming a miniature solar system. This discovery had enormous implications for the long-standing debate about the structure of the cosmos. The Ptolemaic system, which had been the accepted model for over 1,000 years, placed Earth at the center of the universe, with the sun, moon, planets, and stars all revolving around it. The Copernican system, proposed by Nicolaus Copernicus in 1543, suggested instead that the sun was at the center, with Earth and the other planets revolving around it. This heliocentric model explained certain astronomical observations more elegantly than the geocentric Ptolemaic system, but it was controversial, seeming to contradict both common sense, since we don't feel the Earth moving, and certain passages of Scripture that spoke of the Sun moving across the sky. One of the objections to the Copernican system was that if Earth moved through space while the Moon orbited it, the Moon would be left behind. How could Earth carry the Moon along with it on its orbit around the Sun? But here was Jupiter, clearly in motion across the sky, carrying its own moons along with it. Galileo's discovery proved that this objection was invalid. Moons could indeed orbit a moving planet. It was not proof that Copernicus was right, but it removed one of the major arguments against the heliocentric system and showed that not everything in the heavens revolved around Earth. Galileo published these discoveries in March 1610 in a short book called Sidereus Nuncius, the Starry Messenger. Written in Latin so it could be read by scholars across Europe, the book caused an immediate sensation. In clear prose, Galileo described his telescope, how it was made, and how to use it, and then detailed his observations of the Moon and Jupiter's moons. He included drawings of what he had seen, careful sketches of the lunar surface, and diagrams showing the positions of Jupiter's moons on different nights. The book was a bestseller by the standards of the time, and Galileo suddenly found himself famous throughout Europe. He named Jupiter's moons the Medicean stars, after his former pupils, the sons of Cosimo de' Medici, who was now the Grand Duke of Tuscany. This was a shrewd political move. Galileo was hoping to secure patronage from the Medici court in Florence, to return to Tuscany in a position that would give him more time for research and less obligation to teach. The dedication worked. Cosimo was flattered and impressed. In September 1610, Galileo was appointed chief mathematician and philosopher to the Grand Duke of Tuscany, with a substantial salary and no teaching duties. After 18 years in Padua, Galileo returned to Florence, now as a celebrated figure, supported by one of the most powerful families in Italy. But his telescopic observations did not stop. Over the following months and years, Galileo made more discoveries. He observed that Venus showed phases like the Moon, appearing sometimes as a full disk, sometimes as a crescent. This was impossible to explain in the Ptolemaic system, where Venus was supposed to always be between Earth and the Sun. But it made perfect sense in the Copernican system, where Venus orbited the Sun, and thus showed different phases, depending on its position relative to Earth and the Sun. He observed that Saturn appeared to have odd bulges, or companions on either side, though his telescope was not powerful enough to resolve these into the rings we know today. He would be puzzled by Saturn's changing appearance for years. He looked at the Milky Way and saw that it was not a continuous band of light, but was composed of innumerable individual stars, too faint and numerous to be distinguished without a telescope. He observed sunspots, dark patches that appeared on the surface of the Sun, moved across it, and then disappeared, only to reappear on the other side days later. This proved that the Sun rotated, and that its surface was not perfectly uniform. Even the Sun, the most prominent celestial body, showed change and imperfection. Imagine Galileo during these years, night after night, sketching what he saw, making careful measurements of positions and sizes, recording the dates and times of his observations in meticulous notes. He was not just collecting curiosities, he was building a systematic case through observation that the universe was not structured the way Aristotelian philosophy and Ptolemaic astronomy claimed. The heavens were not perfect and unchanging. Celestial bodies were not fundamentally different from Earth, and not everything revolved around our planet. The telescope had revealed new worlds and forced fundamental questions about our place in the cosmos. These discoveries brought Galileo acclaim, but also trouble. Many professors and philosophers committed to the Aristotelian worldview taught in the universities were hostile to his findings. Some refused to even look through a telescope, dismissing the observations as tricks of the lenses or illusions. Others looked but found ways to explain away what they saw to preserve the old cosmology. And within the Catholic Church, there were those who began to worry about the theological implications of these new discoveries, particularly if they supported the Copernican system. For the moment, though, Galileo was celebrated, his work praised by many Jesuits and church officials who were interested in the new astronomy. The conflicts that would later define his life were still gathering on the horizon, not yet unavoidable. In the early 1610s, Galileo was at the height of his fame and productivity. His telescopic discoveries had made him a celebrity, and he was secure in his position at the Medici court in Florence. He corresponded with scholars throughout Europe, sharing observations and ideas. He continued to refine his telescopes and to make new observations. But increasingly, he was drawn into debates about the Copernican system and its implications. Galileo had been convinced of the basic correctness of the Copernican heliocentric model since his days in Padua, perhaps even earlier. The mathematical elegance of the system appealed to him, and his observations, particularly the phases of Venus and the moons of Jupiter, provided strong evidence for it. But discussing the Copernican system was delicate. Copernicus's book, De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium, published in 1543, had been allowed by the Church, read and studied by scholars, but generally treated as a mathematical hypothesis useful for calculations rather than as a description of physical reality. As long as heliocentrism was presented as a convenient mathematical model, it was acceptable, but to claim it was actually true, that the Earth really moved through space orbiting the Sun, raised questions. Those questions were both scientific and theological. Scientifically, if the Earth moved, why didn't we feel it? Why didn't objects fly off its surface? Why did dropped objects fall straight down, rather than being left behind as the Earth rushed forward? These were legitimate questions, and the answers required developing new concepts of motion and inertia that Galileo and later Newton would work out. Theologically, the concern was with certain passages of Scripture that seemed to describe the sun moving, not the Earth. Joshua commanding the sun to stand still, Psalms describing the sun rising and setting, Ecclesiastes saying the sun rises and sets and hastens back to where it arose. If Scripture was read literally on these points, the Earth was stationary and the sun moved. The Church's position at this time was complex. The Council of Trent, in response to the Protestant Reformation, had decreed that Scripture should not be interpreted contrary to the unanimous consensus of the Church Fathers, and that individual believers should not interpret Scripture independently on matters of faith and morals. If the Earth's motion or stability was considered a matter of faith, then claiming Earth moved contradicted the apparent literal meaning of certain biblical passages, which was a problem. However, there was also a long tradition, going back to St. Augustine and earlier, of interpreting Scripture allegorically or accommodatively when a literal reading conflicted with established truth. The question was whether the Copernican system counted as established truth, or was still just a hypothesis. Galileo believed it was true, or at least that the evidence strongly supported it, and he thought the Church should not tie its authority to an outdated cosmology. In 1613, he began writing letters on the subject, arguing that Scripture and natural observation could not truly contradict each other, since both came ultimately from God. When they seemed to conflict, the solution was to reinterpret Scripture in light of demonstrated natural facts, not to deny the facts. This was, he argued, what St. Augustine had advised. Scripture taught how to go to heaven, not how the heavens go, as Galileo later quoted from Cardinal Baronius. One of Galileo's letters, written to his student Benedetto Castelli in 1613, was read aloud at the Medici court and circulated among scholars. It argued for the independence of natural philosophy from biblical interpretation on physical matters. In 1615, Galileo expanded these ideas in a longer letter to Christina of Lorraine, the Grand Duchess of Tuscany. This letter to the Grand Duchess Christina was a sophisticated piece of theological and philosophical reasoning. arguing that the Bible was written in the language of common people, accommodating itself to their understanding, and that on matters of natural philosophy, the Bible was not intended to teach literal physical facts, but spiritual truths. These arguments were reasonable and thoughtful, drawing on respected theological traditions. But they were also dangerous, putting Galileo, a layman and a mathematician, into the realm of biblical interpretation and theology, which was the domain of the Church. Some Dominican friars in Florence began preaching against Galileo and the Copernican system, claiming it was heretical. One friar, Tommaso Caccini, even denounced Galileo to the Inquisition in Rome in 1615, claiming he was spreading ideas contrary to Scripture. Galileo believed he could defend himself and convince the church authorities of the reasonableness of his position. In December 1615, he traveled to Rome to argue his case. He spent several months in Rome, meeting with cardinals, Jesuit astronomers, and other influential figures. He demonstrated his telescope and discussed the evidence for the Copernican system. He was well received in many quarters. He was, after all, a celebrated figure, and many in the church were genuinely interested in the new astronomy. But others were wary. The church was still reeling from the Protestant Reformation and was cautious about anything that might undermine its authority or create further controversy. In February 16, the matter came to a head. The Inquisition asked a panel of theologians to assess two propositions. First, that the sun is the center of the world and completely immovable. Second, that the earth is not the center of the world and moves with both a daily rotation and an annual orbit. The panel declared both propositions to be philosophically foolish and absurd, and formally heretical, or at least erroneous in faith, because they contradicted the literal sense of Scripture. Based on this judgment, Cardinal Robert Bellarmine, a leading theologian and one of the most respected figures in the Church, met privately with Galileo and instructed him that he must not hold or defend the Copernican doctrine as true. There is some ambiguity and later dispute about the exact wording and force of this admonition, whether Galileo was forbidden merely from teaching it as fact or from discussing it at all, even hypothetically. But the essential message was clear. Galileo was to stop promoting Copernicanism as the true description of the universe. Shortly afterward, Copernicus's book De Revolutionibus was placed on the Index of Forbidden Books, pending corrections that would make clear it was a mathematical hypothesis, not a claim about physical reality. Galileo returned to Florence, disappointed, but not, it seems, crushed. He had not been condemned personally, had not been forced to recant any views publicly, and the private admonition from Bellarmine had been relatively mild. Cardinal Bellarmine even provided him with a certificate stating that Galileo had not been forced to abjure or do penance for any heresy, which Galileo carefully kept, knowing it might be important later. Galileo seems to have believed that eventually, as more evidence accumulated, the Church would accept the reality of the Copernican system, and that his role was to continue gathering that evidence. For the next several years, Galileo was relatively quiet on the Copernican controversy. He continued his observations and his work on other problems. He studied methods for determining longitude at sea using the moons of Jupiter as a celestial clock, though the practical difficulties proved insurmountable for ships at sea. He worked on a treatise on motion that he never finished. He engaged in a bitter dispute about the nature of comets with a Jesuit astronomer, a controversy that grew personal and unpleasant, further straining his relationships with the Jesuits who had initially been supportive of his telescopic work. These years were productive, but also marked by increasing frustration and isolation. Galileo's health, never robust, began to trouble him more frequently. He suffered from hernias, arthritis, and bouts of severe illness that kept him confined to bed for weeks at a time. Yet through all this, he did not abandon his conviction that the Earth moved around the Sun. He simply waited, hoping for a time when it would be safer and more productive to return to the argument. That opportunity seemed to arrive in 1623, when Cardinal Maffeo Barberini, a man who had been friendly to Galileo and who appreciated science and learning, was elected Pope, taking the name Urban VIII. Galileo had hopes that under this new intellectually inclined pope, the climate might be more favorable for discussing the Copernican system. This hope would lead him to write the book that would define his legacy and lead to his most famous trial. But in the early 1620s, as he contemplated what to write and how to present it, the future still seemed open, full of possibility rather than peril. When Maffeo Barberini became Pope Urban VIII in 1623, Galileo saw an opportunity. Urban had been a patron and friend, a cultured man who wrote poetry and valued learning. Surely, Galileo thought, such a man would be open to a reasoned discussion of the world systems, the Ptolemaic and the Copernican. In 1624, Galileo traveled to Rome and had several audiences with the new pope. They discussed the structure of the cosmos and the evidence from observations. Urban expressed interest, though he cautioned Galileo about presenting the Copernican system as proven fact. The Pope argued that since God was omnipotent, he could have made the universe work in any number of ways to produce the observations we see, and human reason alone could never absolutely prove which system God had actually chosen. This argument, sometimes called the argument from divine omnipotence, meant that while it was acceptable to discuss the Copernican system as a hypothesis, one should not claim it was definitively true. Galileo left Rome encouraged, believing he had permission to write a book comparing the two systems, as long as he presented both fairly and did not claim absolute proof for Copernicus. He spent the next several years working on this book, which he titled Dialogo sopra I due massimi sistemi del mondo, the dialogue concerning the two chief world systems. Published in 1632, it was structured as a conversation among three characters over the course of 4 days, debating the merits of the Ptolemaic geocentric system versus the Copernican heliocentric system. The three characters were carefully chosen. Salviati represented the intelligent, educated supporter of Copernicus, presenting the arguments and evidence for the heliocentric system. Sagredo was an educated layman, curious and open-minded, who listened to both sides and often found Salviati's arguments convincing. Simplicio was the defender of Aristotle and Ptolemy, presenting the traditional arguments and often being shown to be mistaken or illogical. The name Simplicio was borrowed from a historical commentator on Aristotle, but it also suggested simpleton in Italian, and readers could not help but notice that Simplicio's arguments were systematically dismantled and often made to look foolish. The dialogue was written in Italian rather than Latin, making it accessible to a broader educated audience beyond just scholars. It was lively, witty, and at times sarcastic. Galileo's literary skill made the arguments for Copernicus compelling and the objections seem weak, although the book formally ended with Simplicio presenting Pope Urban's argument about divine omnipotence, and with Sagredo saying that this was a profound point. The overall effect of the dialogue was to strongly favor the Copernican system. Any reader coming to it without a strong prior commitment to Aristotle would almost certainly come away convinced that Copernicus was right, and that the geocentric system was outdated. Galileo obtained permission to publish the dialogue from the church censors, though the process involved some negotiation and revisions. When it was published in Florence in 1632, it was an immediate success. Copies sold rapidly, and it was read avidly across Italy and beyond. But the reaction in Rome was not what Galileo had hoped. Pope Urban VIII felt personally betrayed. He recognized his own argument about divine omnipotence being put into the mouth of Simplicio, the foolish character, which seemed to mock him. The fact that the book so clearly favored Copernicus, despite its formal neutrality, made it appear that Galileo had flouted the 1616 admonition to not hold or defend the Copernican doctrine. In August 1632, just months after publication, the Inquisition banned further sale of the dialogue and ordered Galileo to come to Rome to stand trial. Galileo was 68 years old, in poor health, and the journey to Rome in winter would be arduous. He pleaded to be allowed to send written testimony or to be examined in Florence. but his requests were denied. In February 1633, he made the difficult journey to Rome, taking up residence at the Tuscan embassy. The trial process was slow and opaque. The Inquisition operated in secrecy, and Galileo was not always clear on what the charges against him were or what evidence was being considered. It emerged that a document from 1616, supposedly a formal injunction forbidding Galileo from teaching or discussing Copernicanism in any way, had been found in the Inquisition files. Galileo maintained that he had only received a milder admonition from Cardinal Bellarmine, and he produced Bellarmine's certificate to that effect. There was, and still is, scholarly debate about whether this harsher document was authentic or had been forged or improperly introduced into the file, but the Inquisition chose to give it weight. The charge ultimately came down to suspicion of heresy for having defended and taught a doctrine contrary to Scripture after being instructed not to do so. In April, Galileo was interrogated. He defended himself by arguing that the dialogue presented both sides and did not definitively support Copernicus. This was not a convincing defense to anyone who had actually read the book. Under pressure, and possibly fearing torture, though he was never actually tortured, Galileo began to concede ground. He admitted that, rereading his dialogue, he could see that he might have made the Copernican arguments appear too strong, that his literary vanity had perhaps led him to present them more forcefully than he had intended, and that he had erred. This partial confession was not enough. In June 1633, the Inquisition delivered its verdict. The dialogue was formally banned. Galileo was found vehemently suspect of heresy for having held and taught that the sun is the center of the world and immovable, and that the earth moves. He was required to formally abjure, curse, and detest these errors and heresies. The sentence was house arrest for the remainder of his life, commutable to confinement in a formal prison at the discretion of the Inquisition, and the recitation of penitential psalms once a week for 3 years as assigned penance. On June the 22nd, 1633, in the convent of Santa Maria sopra Minerva in Rome, Galileo knelt and read aloud a prepared statement of abjuration. In it, he stated that he had been judged vehemently suspect of heresy, that he had held and believed that the sun is the center of the world, and immobile, and that the earth moves, and that he abjured, cursed, and detested these errors, swearing he would never again say or assert anything that would cause similar suspicion. It was a humiliating moment for a man who had been celebrated across Europe, who had revealed the moons of Jupiter and the phases of Venus, who knew with deep certainty that the earth did indeed move. There is a famous legend that after his abjuration, as Galileo rose from his knees, he muttered under his breath, "Eppur si muove," and yet it moves. It is a wonderful story, encapsulating the image of a defiant scientist remaining true to observed reality despite institutional pressure. However, there is no contemporary evidence that Galileo actually said this. The phrase seems to have appeared in biographies written long after his death. It is likely apocryphal, a symbol of what people felt he should have said, or would have said, even if he did not. In reality, the 70-year-old Galileo, exhausted and facing the power of the Inquisition, did what he needed to do to avoid harsher punishment. He recanted, accepted his sentence, and prepared to live out his remaining years in confinement. The sentence could have been much worse. Heresy could carry a death penalty. Giordano Bruno had been burned at the stake in 1600 for heretical views that included, among other things, supporting an infinite universe with innumerable worlds. Galileo was spared prison in the formal sense. His house arrest was initially served at the residence of the Archbishop of Siena, a friend who treated him kindly, and later at his own villa in Arcetri, near Florence. He was forbidden from publishing or receiving visitors without permission, but he was not thrown into a dungeon or executed. Nevertheless, it was a catastrophic end to his public intellectual life, a silencing of one of the brightest minds of the age. After his trial, Galileo was eventually allowed to return to his villa in Arcetri, a small house in the hills outside Florence, surrounded by vineyards and olive trees. The villa, which he called Il Gioiello, the jewel, became his prison. He was under strict house arrest, forbidden to travel or to receive visitors without explicit permission from the Inquisition. Officially, he was not to discuss or publish anything on the motion of the Earth or the Copernican system. For a man who had spent his life in vigorous intellectual exchange, who thrived on debate and correspondence, this isolation was a heavy burden. His personal life during these years was marked by loss. His beloved daughter Virginia, who had become Sister Maria Celeste in the convent of San Matteo in Arcetri, nearby, had been a source of great comfort and support to him. She wrote him letters full of warmth, care, and practical advice, managing some of his household affairs and providing emotional support during the trial. In 1634, just a year after Galileo's return to Arcetri, she died suddenly, probably of dysentery, at the age of 33. Galileo was devastated. He sank into a deep depression, writing to a friend that he felt immense sadness and melancholy, having lost the one who was his greatest comfort. The loss haunted him, and he was never quite the same afterward. His health, already declining, worsened. He suffered from hernias that caused him significant pain, recurring bouts of illness, and insomnia. Then, in 1637, he began to lose his sight. It may have been cataracts, or glaucoma, or possibly damage from having looked at the sun through his telescope years earlier while observing sunspots, though he had tried to use projection methods to avoid direct viewing. By 1638, he was almost completely blind, able to see only dim shapes and light. For someone whose work had been built on careful observation, who had peered through a telescope to see what no human had seen before, blindness was a cruel irony. Galileo himself noted the tragedy, writing that the heavens, the world, and the universe, which, with my wonderful observations and clear demonstrations, I had enlarged 100 and 1,000 times beyond what was commonly seen by the wise of all centuries, were now diminished and restricted for me to the space occupied by my own body. Yet even in these dire circumstances, Galileo continued to work. Unable to conduct observations, he turned back to the problem that had occupied him in his Padua years, the science of motion. He had volumes of notes and ideas from decades of thought and experiment on how objects move, fall, and resist forces. With the help of students and assistants, particularly Vincenzo Viviani and Evangelista Torricelli, who came to live with him and serve as his secretary and companion, Galileo dictated and organized this work into a new book. This book, published in 1638 in Leiden in the Netherlands, beyond the reach of the Roman Inquisition, was titled Discorsi e dimostrazioni matematiche intorno a due nuove scienze, Discourses and Mathematical Demonstrations relating to two new sciences. Like the dialogue, it was structured as a conversation among three characters, Salviati, Sagredo, and Simplicio, discussing now not astronomy, but mechanics and the strength of materials. The two new sciences were the study of the strength of materials and the study of motion, including naturally accelerated motion like falling objects and projectile motion. The Discorsi was in many ways Galileo's most important scientific work. In it, he laid out the mathematical laws governing falling bodies, showing that objects fall with uniform acceleration, that the distance fallen is proportional to the square of the time elapsed. He described the parabolic paths of projectiles, providing a mathematical framework for understanding ballistics and any object thrown or launched. He analyzed the pendulum, the inclined plane, and the behavior of beams and structures. All of this was presented with careful reasoning, mathematical proof, and reference to experiments, real or thought experiments, designed to clarify principles. This work laid the foundation for classical mechanics, the branch of physics that would be fully developed by Isaac Newton later in the century. Newton himself acknowledged his debt to Galileo, building on the understanding of motion and acceleration that Galileo had established. The Discorsi was not polemical. It did not challenge the Church or engage in forbidden topics. It was pure science, the product of a lifetime of thought, distilled into clear principles and mathematical relationships. It was Galileo's final gift to the world, a demonstration that even in his old age, blind and confined, his mind remained sharp, still capable of profound insights into the workings of nature. Galileo spent his last years quietly at Arcetri. Visitors did come occasionally, having obtained permission or coming informally. John Milton, the English poet, visited him in 1638 and later wrote of meeting the aged astronomer under house arrest, an image that would influence Milton's own thinking about freedom and authority. Galileo continued to correspond with friends and scholars across Europe, though always carefully aware that his letters might be monitored. He worked on other problems, dictating thoughts on various topics, but mostly his days were spent in the company of his assistants, reminiscing, refining old ideas, waiting. On January 8, 1642, Galileo Galilei died at his villa in Arcetri. He was 77 years old. The Grand Duke of Tuscany wanted to erect a grand tomb for him in the main body of the Basilica of Santa Croce in Florence, but the Church objected. The Inquisition's prohibition was still in force. Galileo had died under sentence for vehement suspicion of heresy. A public monument might give the impression that his views were being honored, so Galileo was buried quietly in a small room off the main church, a modest interment for a man who had changed humanity's understanding of the cosmos. It would be nearly a century before his body was moved to a grand tomb in the main basilica, placed alongside Michelangelo and Machiavelli, recognized finally as one of the great figures of Italian and human achievement. But on that January day in 1642, he was simply an old man who had run afoul of the authorities, whose books were banned, whose name was associated with disobedience and suspicion. The world he left behind was one that had begun to change because of him, even if it had not yet fully acknowledged what he had done or forgiven him for doing it. It took time for the world to understand what Galileo had truly accomplished. His immediate legacy was complicated by the trial and the prohibition against his works. In Catholic countries, the dialogue remained on the Index of Forbidden Books until 1835, nearly 200 years after its publication. The Discorsi could be read since it did not touch on forbidden topics, and it influenced the development of physics throughout the 17th century, but Galileo's name carried the taint of condemnation in much of Europe. Yet his ideas could not be suppressed. Scientists and natural philosophers across Europe, particularly in Protestant countries where the Roman Inquisition held no sway, continued the work Galileo had begun. Christian Huygens in the Netherlands built better telescopes and discovered the true nature of Saturn's rings, which Galileo had seen but could not resolve clearly. He also developed a working pendulum clock based on principles Galileo had uncovered. Giovanni Cassini in France observed the moons of Saturn and measured the rotation periods of Mars and Jupiter. Robert Hooke in England explored the microscopic world and formulated ideas about planetary motion. And Isaac Newton, born the same year Galileo died, would synthesize and extend Galileo's insights into motion and mechanics into a comprehensive theory of gravity and dynamics that would dominate physics for centuries. Newton's Principia Mathematica, published in 1687, explicitly built on Galileo's work. Newton's first law of motion, that a body in motion stays in motion unless acted upon by a force, directly contradicted Aristotle and embodied the insights Galileo had developed about inertia. Newton's second law, relating force, mass, and acceleration, formalized the relationships Galileo had explored in his studies of falling bodies and inclined planes. Newton famously said that if he had seen further, it was by standing on the shoulders of giants. Galileo was one of those giants, a predecessor whose work made Newton's synthesis possible. Beyond the specific discoveries, Galileo's legacy was methodological. He demonstrated that the study of nature should be based on observation and experiment, not on ancient authority. He showed that mathematics was the language in which the book of nature was written, that quantitative measurement and mathematical description could reveal underlying laws governing physical phenomena. He pioneered the use of instruments, the telescope and later the microscope, to extend human senses and reveal what was otherwise invisible. He insisted on testing ideas against reality, on devising experiments, even thought experiments, to clarify concepts and resolve disputes. This approach, sometimes called the scientific method, though Galileo himself never used that term, became the foundation of modern science. It was not entirely new with Galileo. Predecessors like Roger Bacon and others had advocated for observation and experimentation, but Galileo practiced it systematically and successfully, showing how powerful it could be, and his example inspired generations of scientists. By the 18th century, during the Enlightenment, Galileo was celebrated as a hero of reason and science, a martyr who had been persecuted for seeking truth. Voltaire and other Enlightenment thinkers held him up as an example of the courage required to stand against dogma and superstition. The Catholic Church's relationship with Galileo remained complex. For centuries, the Church maintained that the trial had been justified, or at least not discussed publicly. It was not until the 20th century that a process of re-evaluation began. In 1992, more than 350 years after his trial, Pope John Paul II formally acknowledged that errors had been made in Galileo's case, that the theologians who condemned him had been mistaken, and that Galileo had been right about the motion of the Earth. The Pope stated that Galileo had suffered unjustly at the hands of the Church, and he expressed regret for how the case had been handled. It was a remarkable statement, a formal recognition that the Church had been wrong, and Galileo had been right. An apology centuries too late for Galileo himself, but symbolically important. Why does Galileo matter today? Why do we remember him? Why does his story resonate? In part, it is because of the sheer drama of his life, the trial, and the conflict between science and authority. But more fundamentally, it is because of what he represents. Galileo showed that the universe is knowable, that human beings, through careful observation and reasoning, can understand how nature works. He taught us to question received wisdom, to test ideas, to trust evidence over authority. He demonstrated that reality does not care about our philosophies or our dogmas. The moons of Jupiter orbit that planet, whether Aristotle said celestial bodies could do that or not, and the Earth moves through space, regardless of what Scripture seems to say when read literally. Galileo's genius lay in his combination of skills and qualities. He was a brilliant observer, noticing details that others missed, like the changing phases of Venus or the regularity of the pendulum's swing. He was a skilled experimentalist, devising ways to test ideas about motion and mechanics. He was a gifted mathematician, able to formulate relationships in precise quantitative terms. He was a clear writer and communicator, able to explain complex ideas in accessible language. He was courageous, willing to stand by what he had observed, even when it brought him into conflict with the most powerful institution of his age. And he was persistent, continuing to work even when old, sick, and blind, driven by an insatiable curiosity about how the world worked. Perhaps most remarkably, Galileo saw further than his contemporaries, not because he had better eyes, but because he had better tools and better questions. He understood that to see the moons of Jupiter, you needed a telescope. To understand motion, you needed to strip away complications and think about ideal cases. To describe nature accurately, you needed mathematics. He made the invisible visible and the complex comprehensible. That is genius. Consider the scope of what one man accomplished in a single lifetime. He did not discover the laws of gravity. That was Newton. He did not invent the telescope. That was the Dutch spectacle makers. He did not propose the heliocentric system. That was Copernicus. But he took the telescope and turned it into an instrument of discovery, revealing new worlds. He took the Copernican hypothesis and found evidence that supported it, transforming it from a convenient mathematical model into a description of reality. He took the study of motion and made it mathematical and precise, laying the groundwork for classical mechanics. He did not do everything, but the things he did changed everything. Imagine a world where Galileo had never lived. The telescope would still have been invented, and someone else would have pointed it at the sky. Copernicus's book would still have been written. Newton would still have been born. But how much longer would it have taken for these pieces to come together? How many more years before someone with Galileo's combination of skill, insight, and determination appeared to do what he did? The trajectory of human understanding might have been delayed by decades, perhaps longer. Galileo accelerated the scientific revolution, and in doing so, he changed the course of history. His story also reminds us of the cost of that progress. Galileo paid a price for his discoveries and his insistence on their truth. He lost his freedom, spent his final years in isolation, was forced to deny publicly what he knew to be true. The conflict between new knowledge and established authority is not always resolved peacefully or justly. Even today, scientists and thinkers who challenge prevailing paradigms or powerful interests can face opposition, ostracism, or worse. Galileo's trial stands as a cautionary tale about what happens when institutions prioritize authority and tradition over evidence and reason. Yet the story also offers hope. Despite the condemnation, despite the censorship, and the house arrest, the truth Galileo revealed did not disappear. His books were banned, but they were smuggled out of Italy and published in the Netherlands. They were read in secret, copied, and circulated. The observations he made could be repeated by anyone with a telescope. The experiments he described could be performed again. The mathematics he developed could be checked and verified. Truth, once discovered and properly documented, has a resilience. It can be suppressed for a time, but it persists, waiting to be rediscovered and eventually accepted. As you drift toward sleep tonight, think about Galileo looking through his telescope on a winter evening in 1610, seeing the moons of Jupiter for the first time. Think about the excitement and wonder he must have felt, realizing that he was seeing something no human had ever seen before, and that what he was seeing changed everything. Think about the quiet determination with which he recorded his observations, made his measurements, and shared his findings with the world, knowing even then that it might bring trouble. Think about the old man, blind and confined, dictating his final work on motion, still trying to understand, still asking questions, still seeking patterns in the chaos. Think about the courage it takes to say, "I have seen this with my own eyes. I have measured it. I have tested it. And I tell you, it is true," even when the world tells you that you are wrong, even when authority demands silence. If this story of a man who looked up at the night sky and refused to accept the limits of what was known has moved you, if it has sparked your own curiosity about the universe or about the history of ideas, consider subscribing to this channel for more stories of remarkable lives told in this calm, reflective way. There are so many other figures whose lives offer lessons and inspiration, whose journeys through time remind us of what human beings are capable of when driven by curiosity and guided by reason. Galileo Galilei showed us that the universe is vast and wonderful, that the Earth is not the center of everything, that we live on a small planet orbiting an ordinary star in an immense cosmos. He showed us that we can understand this cosmos, at least in part, through observation and thought. He reminded us that seeking truth is worth the risk, that knowledge is worth the struggle, and that even in the face of opposition, the work of understanding the world is noble and necessary. As we leave Galileo's world, let us carry with us a piece of his spirit, that insatiable curiosity, that willingness to question, that commitment to looking carefully at the world and describing honestly what we see. The universe is still out there, full of mysteries waiting to be explored, full of questions waiting for the next Galileo to ask them. What do you think about this genius? And tell us who is the most underrated genius in history we should cover in our next documentary. As we leave Galileo's world, let us carry with us a piece of his spirit, that insatiable curiosity, that willingness to question, that commitment to looking carefully at the world and describing honestly what we see. The universe is still out there, full of mysteries waiting to be explored, full of questions waiting for the next Galileo to ask them. What do you think about this genius? And tell us who is the most underrated genius in history we should cover in our next documentary.